Julian Harris watched in disbelief as his estranged wife, Isha, shared a quiet moment with a handsome army officer across the crowded gala hall. The bitterness of the years he had ignored her suddenly hit him, and jealousy twisted inside him. He had taken her for granted, assuming she'd always be there, until now. As the officer leaned in to whisper something in her ear, Julian realized too late. Fate had finally turned its cruel hand. Julian Harris was a man who had everything: wealth, power, influence. As the CEO of Harris Enterprises, his name was known in the highest circles of business, and his face graced the covers of magazines. He was a man who had built an empire from the ground up, never once pausing to consider the personal cost of his success. His days were filled with meetings, deals, and the relentless pursuit of more. But there was something, or rather someone, he had lost along the way. His wife, Aisha. Aisha Harris was the opposite of Julian in every way that mattered. Where Julian was driven by ambition and status, Aisha was rooted in compassion and community. A Harvard-trained lawyer, she had always been the backbone of their relationship, supporting him through thick and thin, even when his eyes and heart wandered elsewhere. She was a woman who had loved him unconditionally, standing by him during his rise to success, all the while watching him slip further into a world that didn't include her. Over the years, Julian's love had become a distant memory, replaced by an insatiable hunger for more. He spent long hours at work, leaving Aisha to manage their home and their marriage alone. What had once been a passionate love story slowly withered into routine, until one day, Aisha found herself silently wondering if Julian even remembered who she was. The little things she used to cherish, the laughter, the late-night talks, the feeling of being seen, disappeared, leaving a hollow space between them. The turning point came when Julian became increasingly consumed by his work. Invitations to dinner, charity galas, and family events were missed with little more than a passing apology. Aisha had started attending those events alone, not out of spite, but out of a quiet realization. She deserved more than this. She deserved a life where she didn't have to beg for attention. So she found it in places outside their marriage, in the charity work she poured herself into, in the friendships she nurtured, and in her own sense of independence. But Julian never saw it. He couldn't, until one fateful night at the gala that would change everything. Aisha, dressed in an elegant black gown, looked radiant as she moved through the crowd. She had attended these events for years, but tonight felt different. She wasn't the neglected wife anymore. She was a woman reclaiming her own life. Meanwhile, Julian, unaware of the seismic shift happening in his own marriage, wandered through the gala in a haze of business deals and networking. It wasn't until he caught a glimpse of her laughing across the room, her eyes locked with another man's, that the truth struck him like a lightning bolt. Julian's eyes locked onto Aisha from across the grand ballroom, his heart skipping a beat as he watched her laugh, her head tilted slightly back in a way that was both effortless and captivating. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, her unburdened, joyful laughter. But it wasn't just the sound that drew him in. It was the man standing next to her. A tall, well-built army officer with a military precision to his every movement. Julian's stomach twisted with an unfamiliar sensation: jealousy. Who was this man? Why was Aisha, his wife, so captivated by him? The officer leaned in closer, speaking in her ear, and for a brief moment, Aisha's lips curled into a smile that Julian didn't recognize. The smile wasn't for him. A sharp pang of regret gnawed at Julian's insides. He had pushed her away for so long, never realizing how much he was losing. And now here she was, thriving, smiling, living a life he hadn't been a part of. His mind raced. Aisha had always been independent, but this was different. There was a spark in her eyes tonight, a radiance he hadn't seen in years, and it wasn't for him. It was for this officer. The feeling that consumed him was both unsettling and maddening. He wanted to rush over and pull her away, to remind her of the years they had spent together, of the love that once existed between them. But he couldn't. He knew he had no right to. He had ignored her for too long, been consumed by his own success, and now he was paying the price. The thought of her being happy with someone else, someone who saw her, who made her feel special, was unbearable. As the night wore on, Julian found himself unable to look away from the scene. He moved through the crowd mechanically, unable to focus on anything else. Aisha was no longer the same woman who had stood by his side all those years. She was someone else now, someone who had learned to live without him. And as the army officer placed a hand gently on her back, Julian felt something shift inside him. It was as if the ground beneath him had cracked open, and he was falling into an abyss of his own making. He could feel the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbling. The power, the wealth, the empire, it all seemed so hollow now. His gaze never left Aisha as she walked across the room with the officer, her hand resting comfortably in his. It was the simplest of gestures, but it cut Julian deeper than any business loss, deeper than any failure he had ever experienced. He had neglected her for so long, assuming she would always be there, waiting for him. Now, as he watched her walk further away from him, with someone else by her side, Julian realized just how wrong he had been. Julian couldn't shake the image of Aisha and the army officer out of his mind. It haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts as the days dragged on after the gala. He had always believed that his success would be enough to win her back, that his empire, his money, his influence could fix anything. But now, faced with the reality of her moving on without him, he realized just how wrong he had been. The thought of another man holding her attention, making her smile the way he used to, was unbearable. The realization that he had neglected the one person who had always been there for him was a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. The following days felt like a blur. Julian threw himself into work, trying to drown out the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Meetings, phone calls, and late-night conference calls filled his schedule, but they did nothing to alleviate the hollow emptiness he felt inside. He had built a billion-dollar empire, but in the process he had lost the one thing that truly mattered: Aisha. Meanwhile, Aisha was thriving. She had always been a force in her own right, but now, in the absence of Julian's constant demands, she was finally living life on her own terms. She had moved into a new apartment, one that she had picked out on her own, a space that was hers and hers alone. She had started volunteering more at local charities, getting involved in causes she was passionate about, and most significantly, she had begun to develop a relationship with the Army officer, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes. Marcus had entered her life at a time when she least expected it. After years of emotional neglect from Julian, she had found someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who respected her intelligence, her drive, and above all, her independence. Their connection had been immediate, a shared understanding that transcended the usual formalities of first meetings. He had asked her about her life, her dreams, her fears, things Julian had long stopped caring about. With Marcus, Aisha felt heard, seen, and appreciated. The more time they spent together, the more Aisha realized how much she had been holding back, how much of herself she had sacrificed in her marriage to Julian. She had given so much to him, to their relationship, but in return she had received nothing but distance and cold indifference. Yet as the weeks passed, she couldn't deny the growing guilt in her chest. She had loved Julian once, deeply, passionately. She hadn't wanted their marriage to end, but after years of being invisible in his life, she had found the courage to move on. Still, the thought of him, the man she had built a life with, brought a sense of melancholy that lingered in her heart. Meanwhile, Julian was spiraling. He had seen Aisha at the gala, but he hadn't realized the depth of her pain until now. The thought of her with someone else felt like a punch to the gut. But it wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. He was terrified that he had lost her for good, that no amount of money or success could fix what he had broken. He had always believed that Aisha would always be there, waiting for him to come around. But she wasn't waiting anymore. As the tension between them grew, Julian made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't sit idly by and watch Aisha slip further away from him. He would fight for her, whatever it took. But as the days passed, he realized that fighting for her might mean more than just asking for her forgiveness. It might mean confronting the very things about himself that had driven her away. The turning point came one fateful evening when Julian stood outside Aisha's apartment, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him like an anchor. He had spent the past few days grappling with the reality of what he had done. The pride that had once driven him now felt like a chain, holding him back from the one thing that could redeem him, Aisha. He had spent years making excuses, blaming his work, blaming his ambition, but tonight, standing in front of the building where Aisha had built a new life, Julian realized the truth. He had never truly valued her. He had loved her, yes, but he had loved the idea of her, the version of her that fit into his world. He had never given her the love, respect, and attention she deserved. And now he feared that it was too late. The door to Aisha's apartment swung open, and there she was, standing in the doorway, a vision of strength and beauty. She was the same Aisha he had married, but so much more. Her presence was no longer the quiet background of his world. She had become the center of her own life, and Julian knew he was standing in the shadow of the woman she had become. Aisha looked at him, her eyes unreadable. She hadn't expected him to show up, not after everything. But there he was, standing in front of her, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. She had spent years yearning for the man who had once promised her the world, only to be ignored in favor of his empire. She had waited for him to see her, to recognize the sacrifices she had made, but now the man before her seemed like a stranger, a man who had learned to feel too late. "I need to talk to you, Aisha," Julian said, his voice cracking as he spoke. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of regret. Aisha studied him for a moment, her expression softening. She had never wanted to be angry with him. She had loved him. No, she had still loved him. But love alone wasn't enough. It never had been. "Why now, Julian?" Aisha asked, her voice steady but laced with hurt. "Why, after all this time, after everything that's happened, you want to come back into my life?" The question hung in the air, a reminder of all the years of neglect, the empty promises, and the lonely nights she had spent waiting for him to come around. She had been patient, but patience had its limits. She had built a new life for herself, a life without him. And yet, standing there, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't as angry as she thought she should be. The moment was heavy with unspoken words, but in the silence, Aisha saw the sincerity in Julian's eyes. It wasn't the arrogance of the man she once knew, the man who had believed the world revolved around him. It was something different, something fragile, something real. "I've been a fool, Aisha," Julian confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I've ignored you, taken you for granted, and assumed you would always be there. I never saw you, not truly. I thought I could build a life on success and ambition, but I was wrong. I've lost you, and now all I can do is try to get you back." Aisha looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had long since stopped waiting for this moment. In the time since their separation, she had learned to be enough on her own. But hearing him speak, seeing the remorse in his eyes, stirred something inside her. Was it enough? Could she trust him again? Before she could respond, a figure stepped out from the shadows, Marcus, the army officer. He had been waiting nearby, giving Aisha space to talk with Julian, but now he stepped forward, his presence firm and steady. "I didn't want to interrupt," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute, "but I think it's time you both know where I stand." Julian turned to face him, the reality of the situation sinking in. Aisha had moved on. She wasn't the woman he had left behind. She was someone else now, someone who had found a connection with Marcus, someone who was no longer defined by her past with Julian. Julian felt his breath catch in his throat as Marcus stepped forward, his hand outstretched in a gesture that was both protective and resolute. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always been the one in control, always the one who commanded respect with a glance, with his wealth and influence. But here, in front of Aisha, in front of Marcus, he was powerless. Aisha had moved on. She wasn't waiting for him anymore. She had found someone who saw her, truly saw her, in a way Julian never had. The jealousy bubbled up inside him, raw and consuming, but it was tinged with something else, guilt. He had spent years ignoring her, believing that the comforts of his success could replace the love and partnership they once shared. Now, standing in the shadows of his own failure, he realized how deeply he had underestimated Aisha's strength. "You really think you can just walk back into my life and make everything right?" Aisha's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. It was steady, but there was an edge to it. "After all this time, after everything you've done, you think I owe you forgiveness?" Her words hit Julian like a thunderclap. He had spent so long hiding from the truth, hoping that time would heal everything, that he could buy his way back into her heart. But Isha wasn't interested in his wealth anymore. She had learned that her worth wasn't tied to him or his empire. Marcus stood silently beside her, but his presence was enough. Julian could see it now. The way Isha's posture had changed, the way her confidence radiated. She was no longer the woman who would have waited for him to come around. She had found someone who respected her independence, her strength. Julian's mind raced. He had pushed Aisha to the edge, driven her away with his neglect, and now he was faced with the consequences. He could see the life he had lost slipping further away from him with each passing second. And yet, there was a part of him, a small, desperate part, that wasn't ready to give up. "I never thought you owed me forgiveness," Julian said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I've been an idiot, Aisha. I've spent years chasing something that didn't matter, and in the process, I let you slip through my fingers. I don't deserve another chance. I know that. But I can't stand the thought of losing you forever. I can't stand the thought of you being with someone else." Aisha's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the truth of it all settled in. She had loved Julian, but the love she had once given him had been poisoned by his indifference. She had spent so long waiting for him to change, for him to notice her, but she had realized that she was the one who needed to change, to stop waiting and start living for herself. "I'm not the same person I was, Julian," she said, her voice firm. "I've moved on, and I won't go back, not to you, not to a life where I'm ignored. I've built something for myself, and I won't let it be torn down by the ghosts of our past." The finality in her words was like a door slamming shut, and Julian felt the last of his hopes crumble. This wasn't the way he had imagined it. He had thought he could fix things, could convince her to give him another chance. But now, with Marcus standing by her side, Julian understood the depth of his mistake. He had destroyed the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. Julian stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The words Isha had spoken reverberated in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "I've moved on. I won't go back." They echoed through him like a death knell, signaling the end of a chapter in his life he had long taken for granted. But even in the face of her rejection, something inside him shifted. He could feel it, a surge of desperation, but also an undeniable clarity. Aisha had moved on. She had found someone who loved her for the person she had become, not the person he had tried to mold her into. And for the first time in years, Julian saw the enormity of what he had lost. His wealth, his empire, the power he wielded in every boardroom, all of it seemed insignificant now. The only thing that truly mattered had been slipping away from him for so long, and now it was too late. But there was still one thing left to do. For once, Julian had to do what he had never done before: step out of the shadows of his own pride and take responsibility for the damage he had caused. He turned to Marcus, his voice low but steady. "I don't deserve her forgiveness. I've made a mess of everything. But I won't stand here and pretend like I don't care. Isha deserves better than I've ever given her." Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Julian expected anger, resentment, maybe even mockery, but instead he saw something else: understanding. For a moment, the tension between them eased. "I'm not here to fight you, Julian," Marcus said, his voice calm and measured. "I'm here because Isha deserves to be happy, with or without me. She deserves to feel seen, to feel loved. That's all I care about. And if you can't give her that, then I'll stand by her side." The words stung, but they were also a wake-up call. Julian realized that the fight wasn't about winning Aisha back or about battling Marcus for her affection. The fight was internal, about his own transformation, about realizing that the things that had defined him, his career, his status, were all meaningless if they had come at the cost of the one person who had ever truly mattered to him. Aisha had found happiness without him. She had moved on, rebuilt her life, and found someone who valued her for everything she was. And Julian finally understood the gravity of what that meant. "I'm not asking for a second chance," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking for you to forgive me, but I am asking for the opportunity to change, to become a better man. Not for you, but for myself. I don't want to be the man I was anymore. I can't be." Aisha's eyes softened as she looked at him. There was still hurt, still a lingering sadness, but there was something else too, something that she hadn't expected to feel: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Julian could change. But it wasn't her responsibility to fix him anymore. She had done enough of that for both of them. "I don't need you to change for me, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need you to change for yourself. You have to learn to live with the consequences of your actions, to rebuild the man you want to be. But that journey, it's yours to take, not mine." Julian nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He realized that this moment, this painful, raw moment, was the beginning of his own journey, a journey of self-discovery, of growth, of becoming a man who no longer relied on the trappings of success to define him. It was the first step toward redemption, not for Aisha's love, but for his own peace of mind. The weeks that followed were a period of quiet transformation for Julian. He threw himself into self-reflection, not to win back Aisha, but to understand the man he had become and how he could rebuild himself from the inside out. He began attending therapy, something he had always dismissed as unnecessary, but now he saw it as a critical step toward understanding his own behaviors, his greed, his neglect, and his inability to connect with those he loved. Aisha, on the other hand, continued to live her life with the grace and strength that had always defined her. She had learned to let go of the past, to move forward with a new sense of freedom. Her relationship with Marcus deepened, but it wasn't just about him. It was about her own growth, about claiming a life that was hers and hers alone, one where she wasn't defined by her relationship to Julian or to anyone else. But she couldn't deny the quiet place of empathy she still held for Julian. She knew his journey was far from over, and while she no longer saw him as the man she had once loved, she hoped in some small corner of her heart that he would find peace. For her part, she had made her peace with the past. She had given him every chance to see her, to value her, but now her happiness came from within, not from him. Julian's transformation was slow, but it was real. His work at Harris Enterprises changed too. He started making decisions that prioritized the people who worked for him, taking time to listen to their ideas, their concerns. For the first time in years, Julian Harris wasn't just a CEO, he was a man trying to rebuild his life, step by painful step. And then one day, he found himself walking down the streets of New York, a place he had once viewed only as a backdrop to his business empire. It wasn't the city of his success anymore. It was a city full of possibilities, of people who didn't care about his name or his money, but about who he was at his core. Aisha's face flickered in his mind again, not with the bitterness of the past, but with the warmth of someone who had once loved him. He wondered for the first time if he would ever see her again. He didn't know if he would. He didn't deserve to. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain: the journey to redemption, to becoming a better man, had to be his own. It was no longer about what Aisha could give him or what he could regain from her. It was about finding peace within himself. As Julian stood there, watching the bustle of the city around him, he realized that this quiet moment of self-awareness was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter where success wouldn't be measured by money or power, but by the strength of his character and the depth of his connections. Aisha had moved on, and in doing so, had given him the greatest gift of all, the chance to rebuild his life, not as a billionaire who could buy his way through the world, but as a man who could finally understand the value of what truly mattered.